the night she was taken. She thought she was just collateral, but she had already become something far more valuable. It didn't begin with chaos. That was the first thing that made it wrong. There were no screams echoing through the streets, no sudden violence breaking the silence, no warning signs that something was about to change her life completely. Everything happened smoothly, controlled, precise, as if it had been rehearsed. And in a way, it had. The intellectual hook settled into the moment with quiet clarity. The most dangerous things in the world don't arrive loudly, they arrive perfectly. Avery Quinn never saw it coming. Her life had always been built on independence. She trusted her instincts, relied on her awareness, and moved through the world with a quiet confidence that came from understanding how things worked. She wasn't reckless. She wasn't careless. She wasn't the kind of person who ignored danger. But this wasn't danger she could recognize, because this wasn't random. This was planned. Her night had started like any other, normal, predictable, safe, the kind of normal that gives you the illusion that nothing is about to change. The air had been calm, the city steady, everything moving in its usual rhythm, nothing out of place, nothing unusual, nothing that would make her hesitate. And that was exactly why it worked. Because when everything feels normal, you stop looking for threats. Avery walked with the same quiet awareness she always carried. Her thoughts focused, her movements controlled. There was no fear in her posture, no hesitation in her steps, until something shifted. Not loudly, not obviously, but enough. A presence, a disruption in the rhythm, the kind of subtle change most people would ignore. But not her. She felt it. That moment where the environment no longer feels neutral, where something unseen begins to press against your awareness. She slowed, just slightly, not enough to draw attention, but enough to listen. Nothing, no sound, no movement, just silence. And that silence was wrong, because silence, when it isn't natural, means something is being controlled. Before she could react further, it happened, fast, clean, unavoidable. There was no struggle, no dramatic resistance, because by the time her body understood what was happening, it was already too late. That was the precision of it. The execution was flawless. Every movement calculated, every second accounted for. No wasted action, no unnecessary force, just efficiency and control. Avery's awareness remained sharp even as everything around her shifted, because fear did not take over immediately. Shock did. The kind of shock that freezes your thoughts before it allows you to feel anything else. She wasn't panicking. Not yet. She was processing, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to make sense of something that didn't make sense. But there was no explanation, only reality. And reality was simple. She had been taken. The environment changed around her quickly, from open space to something enclosed, cold, isolated, unfamiliar, the kind of space that removes orientation, removes control, removes everything that makes you feel grounded, and in its place, leaves uncertainty. That was when the fear began. Not overwhelming, not uncontrollable, but present, sharp, focused, because Avery was not weak. She did not collapse under pressure. She adapted. Even now, especially now, her breathing steadied, her thoughts aligned, her awareness sharpened instead of breaking, because survival for her was not about reacting emotionally. It was about staying controlled, even when everything else wasn't. The realization came next, not slowly, not gradually, but instantly. This wasn't random. Nothing about this felt random. The execution was too precise, the timing too perfect, the control too complete. Random actions leave gaps, mistakes, noise. This had none of those, which meant one thing. She had been targeted. The thought settled into her with cold clarity, not chosen by chance, chosen intentionally. And that changed everything, because random danger could be escaped, but targeted danger has a purpose. And purpose means planning, which means someone, somewhere, had decided this would happen. The question was no longer what had happened. The question was why. The answer came sooner than she expected. not through explanation, but through understanding. The way she was handled, the way nothing excessive was done, the way everything remained controlled instead of chaotic. This wasn't personal, not emotional, not impulsive. This was business. She wasn't a victim. She was leverage. The word formed clearly in her mind. A bargaining tool. Something to be used. Something to be exchanged. Something valuable, but not for who she was, for what she represented. That realization should have made things simpler, but it didn't, because value in a world like this is never simple. And if she had value, then someone powerful was involved, because power recognizes value, and only power can execute something this precise. That was when something deeper settled into her awareness. Not fear, not panic, but understanding. This wasn't small. This wasn't isolated. This was connected to something larger, something structured, something controlled. And that meant one thing. The person behind this was not ordinary. The journey continued in silence. Time became unclear. Movement became distant. Everything around her reduced to sensation instead of understanding. Because when control is removed, time stops feeling real. But her mind remained sharp, because that was the only thing she had left, and she refused to lose it. Eventually, the movement stopped, not abruptly, not violently, but deliberately, as if the destination had already been decided long before she was ever taken. Because it had been. Avery felt it immediately. The shift in environment, the difference in space, the controlled stillness that only exists in places built for power. This wasn't temporary. This wasn't random. This was a destination. A final point in a plan that had been executed perfectly from the beginning. She was moved again. Not roughly, not carelessly, but with the same precision as before. Every action measured, every movement intentional. And that only confirmed what she already knew. This was not about chaos. This was about control. She stepped into the space without resistance, not because she accepted it, but because she understood something important. Resistance without understanding leads to failure, and she needed to understand. Everything, the environment around her revealed very little, but what it did reveal was enough. Structure, order, power. The kind of power that does not need to show itself loudly, because it already exists. And as that realization settled into her completely, one final truth became impossible to ignore. This wasn't random. It never had been. She had not been taken by chance. She had been taken with purpose, chosen, positioned, delivered, exactly where someone wanted her to be. And that meant something far more dangerous than fear. It meant intention. As Avery stood in a place she had never been meant to reach, one final realization formed. Sharp, cold, and undeniable. This wasn't random. She was taken for a reason. She was supposed to be temporary. But the moment he saw her, something changed. By the time Avery Quinn understood she had been taken for a reason, she had already arrived at the center of that reason. And that center had a name. Lucian Cross. The environment she had been brought into did not introduce him. It reflected him. Every detail around her carried the same precision she had felt the moment she was taken. Nothing excessive, nothing out of place, nothing uncertain. It was a world built on control, and control always belongs to someone. The intellectual hook settled into silence with sharp clarity. Power doesn't announce itself. It creates a space where nothing can exist without its permission. That was exactly what this place felt like. Not occupied, owned. Avery didn't need to see him to know he was there, because everything around her had already adjusted to his presence. The stillness wasn't natural. It was enforced. The silence wasn't empty. It was controlled. And somewhere within that control was the man responsible for all of it. Lucian Cross did not enter dramatically. He did not need to. His presence was not something that arrived. It was something that already existed. And when he finally stepped into the space, nothing about the environment changed, because it had already been shaped around him. He wasn't loud. He wasn't aggressive. He didn't move with unnecessary force. But there was something undeniable about him. Something that didn't need explanation. Dominance. Not displayed. Not proven. But absolute. Avery saw it immediately, not just in him, but in how everything responded to him. The air shifted, the space adjusted, the control tightened. Because this was not a man who operated within a system. He was a system. His reputation had reached her long before this moment, not through stories, not through details, but through understanding. Men like Lucien Cross were not explained. They were known, ruthless, strategic, untouchable, not because people exaggerated who he was, but because no one survived long enough to misunderstand him. That was what made him dangerous. Not unpredictability, but certainty. Everything about him was calculated, every decision measured, every outcome intentional. And now, she stood directly in front of him, not as an equal, not as a threat, but as something else entirely. Leverage. That was her role. That was why she was here. And that was how he was supposed to see her. Nothing more. Nothing less. A tool. A transaction. A temporary piece in a larger system. That was the plan. That was always the plan. Lucien observed her the way he observed everything, without emotion, without hesitation, without unnecessary attention. His gaze was not curious. It was analytical, assessing, measuring, placing her within a structure he had already built. Because to him, everything had a place. Everything had value. Everything had purpose. And Avery Quinn had already been assigned hers. Or at least, that was what should have happened. But something didn't align. Not visibly, not immediately, but enough to create a shift. Small, subtle, but real. Because when Lucien looked at her, he didn't look away. And that alone was different. Avery felt it, not as fear, not as pressure, but as awareness. The way his attention lingered just a fraction longer than necessary. The way his observation didn't conclude immediately. The way something in his assessment didn't finalize. That wasn't normal. Not for a man like him. Because men like Lucien Cross didn't hesitate. They decided, instantly, completely, without question. But this time, there was a delay. And delay means uncertainty. Even if only for a moment. Avery didn't react. She didn't shift. She didn't allow anything to break the control she had built around herself. Because she understood something important. The moment you react, you reveal. And revealing anything in front of someone like him was a mistake. So she remained still, not weak, not submissive, but controlled, just as he was. And that only made the moment sharper. Because now, it wasn't just him observing her. She was observing him. The silence between them wasn't empty. It was active, filled with unspoken calculation, unspoken awareness, unspoken understanding. He saw something. She knew it. She didn't know what, but she knew it was there. And whatever it was, it changed something. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Because from that moment on, she was no longer just a transaction. Lucien didn't acknowledge the shift. Not outwardly. He didn't question it. Didn't analyze it in a way that could be seen. Because control for him meant never showing uncertainty, even when it existed. But internally, the structure had adjusted. Slightly. A variable had been introduced. And variables change outcomes. Avery remained within his world. Not restrained. Not free. But positioned. Exactly where she was meant to be. But something about that position no longer felt temporary. Not to him. Even if he hadn't fully acknowledged it yet. The deal had already been arranged. The purpose already defined. She was meant to be traded. Exchanged. Used to secure something more valuable. That was how his world worked. Nothing personal. Nothing unnecessary. Just outcome. But time passed. And the deal didn't happen. Not immediately. Not as expected. At first, it seemed strategic. A delay for positioning. For advantage. For control. But then, it continued. Longer than it should have. Longer than made sense. And that was when the shift became undeniable. Because Lucien Cross did not delay without reason. And if there was a reason, it was not one anyone else understood. Not his people. Not his system. Not even the ones who trusted his decisions without question. Because this didn't follow his pattern. Avery noticed it too, not through explanation, but through change. The way the environment adjusted around her, the way her presence no longer felt temporary, the way she was no longer treated as something passing through, but something staying. And that was more dangerous than anything else. Because temporary things have an end, but things that stay become something else entirely. The realization formed slowly, not as fear, but as clarity. She had been brought here as leverage, but she was no longer just leverage. Something had shifted, something she didn't understand yet, something he hadn't explained, and never would, but it was there, between them, in the silence, in the way he observed her, in the way he didn't let her go. As the weight of that realization settled into place, one final truth became impossible to ignore. He was supposed to trade her. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But now, he wasn't, and no one understood why. The deeper she was pulled into his world, the more she realized. Leaving it wouldn't be simple. The delay in the deal was not announced. It was not explained, but it was felt. Avery Quinn understood it not through words, but through change, the kind that exists beneath the surface, where systems shift without breaking. Because Lucien Cross's world did not make mistakes. It adjusted, and now it had adjusted around her. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with quiet precision. The most dangerous places are not the ones that trap you, but the ones that slowly make you part of them. That was exactly what this felt like. At first, she had expected confinement, clear boundaries, defined restrictions, a space that would remind her constantly of what she was, a hostage. But that wasn't what she found. Lucien's world was not built like a prison. It was built like a system, structured, layered, controlled in a way that made everything feel intentional. Nothing was random. Nothing was excessive. Every part of it existed for a reason, and that reason always led back to him. Avery was not locked away, not hidden, not isolated in the way she had prepared for. Instead, she was placed, given space, allowed movement, not unlimited, not uncontrolled, but enough to create confusion. Because control, when it doesn't look like control, becomes harder to recognize. Her position became something undefined. She was not free. That much was clear. Every path she walked existed within boundaries she could not see, but could feel. Every space she entered belonged to a structure she did not control. Every moment she experienced was part of a system that had already accounted for her presence. But she was not treated like a prisoner either. There were no guards watching her every move, no force reminding her of her position, no obvious pressure pushing her into submission. And that was far more unsettling, because clear control can be resisted, but invisible control cannot. Avery adapted quickly, not because she accepted it, but because she understood something critical. Survival inside a system depends on understanding the system. So she observed, carefully, quietly, without drawing attention, because attention, in a place like this, had consequences. Lucien's empire revealed itself slowly, not through explanation, but through pattern. Everything moved with purpose. People did not act randomly. They operated. Decisions flowed downward with precision. Information moved without disruption. Nothing existed without structure. And within that structure, there was no space for error. That was what made it powerful and dangerous, because systems like this do not collapse easily. Avery began to map it in her mind, not fully, not completely, but enough to understand the hierarchy, the flow of control, the way everything aligned without needing instruction. It wasn't chaos. It was order, and order is harder to break than anything else. The psychological tension grew with every moment she spent inside it, not overwhelming, not suffocating, but constant, a quiet pressure that never fully disappeared, because she was always aware this was not her world. She did not belong here, and yet she was part of it now. Fear remained, but it changed. It was no longer sharp, no longer immediate. It became something else, something deeper, something tied to understanding instead of reaction, because the more she saw, the more she realized how controlled everything truly was. And control, when this complete, is impossible to escape without consequence. But alongside that fear, something else began to grow. Curiosity, not intentional, not welcomed, but present. Because understanding a system requires attention, and attention leads to curiosity. She began to notice details. The way decisions were made before they needed to be. The way problems disappeared before they could grow. The way nothing within the empire felt uncertain. Everything was anticipated. Everything was prepared. Everything was controlled. And at the center of it all was Lucian Cross. His behavior toward her remained unchanged, at least on the surface. He was still distant, still controlled, still unreadable in a way that made it impossible to define his intentions. He did not seek her out, did not create unnecessary interaction, did not reduce the distance between them, but he did not increase it either. And that balance was deliberate, because distance, when controlled, creates awareness, and awareness creates tension. Avery felt it, the way his presence existed even when he wasn't there, the way the environment shifted subtly when he entered space, the way everything aligned around him without effort, and more importantly, the way his attention returned to her, not constantly, not obviously, but consistently, enough to matter, enough to be noticed. He studied her, not emotionally, not personally, but strategically, as if she was something he had not yet fully defined. And that uncertainty, even if minimal, changed the dynamic between them, because now she was not just observing him, he was observing her. The contrast between them sharpened. She feared him, not in the same way as before, not immediate, not overwhelming, but present, because she understood what he was capable of, understood the level of control he operated with, understood that nothing in this world existed without his permission, and that included her. But he did not treat her like something he owned, not completely. And that was where everything became more complicated, because ownership is clear. It defines position. It creates boundaries. But this was undefined. He did not restrict her like a prisoner, did not control her like an asset, did not dismiss her like something temporary. Instead, he allowed her to exist within his world, within his system, within his control, but not fully contained by it. And that was more dangerous than anything else, because undefined positions create instability, and instability creates risk. Avery realized it slowly, not through one moment, but through many, the way she moved through his world, the way nothing stopped her, but everything guided her, the way she was never forced, but never free, and most importantly, the way he allowed it, because nothing in this world happened without his decision. And if he had decided to let her exist like this, then it meant something. Something she did not yet understand, but could feel. As the weight of that realization settled into her, one final truth emerged. Quiet, sharp, and impossible to ignore. He's not treating her like a hostage anymore. And that's more dangerous, for the truth she was never meant to find. The shift did not begin with answers. It began with doubt. Not loud, not disruptive, but precise. The kind of doubt that doesn't break what you know, it quietly rearranges it. Avery Quinn had spent enough time inside Lucian Cross's world to understand one thing clearly. Nothing here existed without reason. Every movement, every decision, every silence, all of it was intentional, which meant her presence here was not an accident. That realization did not come suddenly. It formed slowly, through fragments, small details that should have meant nothing, but didn't. A name overheard in passing, a glance that lingered too long, a shift in behavior that didn't align with logic. At first, she dismissed it, because patterns without context are meaningless. But then they began to repeat, and repetition creates structure. Avery started paying attention differently, not to what was obvious, but to what was inconsistent, because inconsistency is where truth hides. The system around her remained as controlled as ever, unshaken, unpredictable in its precision, but within that precision, there were cracks, not visible, Not obvious, but present. Moments where information seemed filtered, where certain names were avoided, where conversations shifted the moment she entered a space. It wasn't fear, it was awareness. And awareness, when shared by others, means something is being concealed. That was when the first real question formed. Not why was she taken, but why was she being kept this way? Because if she was only leverage, her role would have been simple, defined, temporary, transactional. But nothing about her situation felt temporary anymore. She was not being rushed, not being pressured, not being positioned for immediate exchange. Instead, she was being observed, placed, integrated. That didn't align with leverage. It aligned with something else, something deeper. The realization settled into her thoughts with quiet intensity. Leverage is used quickly, but something valuable is studied first. And that changed everything, because now the question wasn't about her value. It was about the nature of it. Avery turned her attention inward, to her past, to everything she had always accepted as complete. And for the first time, she questioned it, not emotionally, not reactively, but analytically. Her life had always made sense. Clear beginnings, clear connections, no missing pieces, or at least that's what she had believed. Now, those pieces felt arranged, too clean, too aligned, as if the story she had been given had been simplified, edited, controlled. Memories surfaced, not new ones, but old ones viewed differently. Conversations that had once seemed ordinary, now carrying weight. Decisions made around her that had never been explained, now feeling intentional. Moments where information had been withheld, subtly, carefully, not enough to raise suspicion at the time, but enough to matter now, because now she was looking for it. And once you start looking, you begin to see. The connections formed slowly, not fully, not completely, but enough to create a pattern. Names that overlapped, timelines that didn't fully align, events that felt too precise to be coincidence. Her past was not random. It had structure, and structure means design. Avery didn't react. Externally, she remained the same, controlled, composed, unreadable, because reacting without full understanding was a mistake she could not afford. But internally, everything had shifted. Fear, once sharp and immediate, began to change, not disappearing, but transforming into something colder, something clearer. Awareness, because fear limits perception, but awareness expands it. And with that expansion came clarity. Lucian Cross, his role in all of this, was no longer simple. If her presence here was not just about leverage, then his decision to keep her was not just strategic. It was informed, which meant he knew something, not everything, but enough. Enough to recognize her value before she did. Enough to delay the deal. Enough to change the outcome. That realization was not comforting. It was dangerous, because knowledge in his hands was never without purpose. Avery began watching him differently, not as a threat, not as a force, but as a source. The way his attention shifted when certain topics surfaced. The way his silence deepened in specific moments. The way his control tightened, not around her, but around information. He wasn't hiding everything, but he was controlling what could be seen. And that alone confirmed it. There was something about her that even his world was not ready to reveal. The tension inside her grew, not chaotic, not overwhelming, but focused, because now she was no longer trying to survive blindly. She was trying to understand her position within something far larger than herself. Her past was not separate from this world. It was connected to it, deeply, structurally, irreversibly. The thought settled into her with quiet force. The most dangerous truths are not discovered. They are remembered in pieces until they can no longer be ignored. And she was remembering, not fully, but enough. Enough to know that she had never been just a random target. Enough to understand that her presence here was not sudden. It was inevitable. Avery didn't need confirmation. She could feel it in the way everything aligned around her, too perfectly, too precisely, as if every step she had taken in her life had led here, to this moment, to this place, to him. The realization didn't bring panic. It brought something far more dangerous: acceptance. Because once you accept that something was planned, you stop looking for escape and start looking for meaning. But meaning in a world like this always comes with consequence, and consequences are never simple. The final piece did not arrive loudly. It never does. It came quietly, through a detail so small. It should have been insignificant, but it wasn't. A name, clear this time, unmistakable, spoken without hesitation. A name that didn't belong in this world, unless it had always been part of it. Her name, connected to something it should not have been connected to, not by coincidence, by history. And in that moment, everything aligned, not perfectly, but enough to reveal the outline of a truth she had never been meant to see. Her kidnapping was not just planned. It was positioned, set into motion long before the night had happened, before she was aware, before she could question, before she could choose. As the weight of that realization settled into something irreversible, one final truth became impossible to ignore. She hadn't just been taken. She had been led here her entire life. The moment she stopped trying to escape, everything started to change. After the truth began to surface, Avery Quinn no longer saw her situation the same way. Before, there had been one clear objective: escape, survive, get out. That had been simple, direct, understandable. But now, nothing was simple anymore. Because once she realized her presence in Lucien Cross's world was not accidental, the idea of leaving stopped being an answer and started becoming a risk. The intellectual hook settled into her awareness with quiet intensity. The moment you understand a game, leaving it becomes more dangerous than staying in it. That was a shift. And once it happened, there was no going back. Avery stopped trying to escape. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but deliberately. The small, instinctive action she had once relied on, observing exits, measuring distances, calculating possibilities, began to fade. Not because she had given up, but because she had understood something deeper. There was no simple way out, not without consequences she could not predict, and unpredictability was no longer something she could afford. So she changed, not on the surface, not in a way that could be easily seen, but internally, completely. Her movements became calmer, more controlled, more intentional. She no longer reacted to her environment. She studied it. She no longer resisted the system. She moved within it, because resistance creates friction, and friction draws attention. But alignment, even temporary, creates opportunity. Her transformation was quiet, but precise. She became observant in a different way, not just watching what happened, but understanding why it happened. The decisions made around her, the timing of actions, the flow of control within Lucien's empire. Everything began to make more sense. And with that understanding came power, not external, not visible, but internal, the kind that allows someone to exist within a system without being consumed by it. Lucien noticed. Of course he did. He always noticed. That was what made him who he was. But this shift was different because it was not reactive. It was intentional. Avery was no longer behaving like someone trapped, no longer carrying the subtle tension of someone waiting for an opportunity to escape. That tension had disappeared, and in its place was control, not his, hers, and that changed everything. His attention toward her increased, not dramatically, not obviously, but consistently. The way he observed her became sharper, more focused, as if something about her no longer aligned with what he had initially defined, because she had changed the pattern, and patterns, when broken, demand attention. The silent tension between them deepened, not aggressive, not confrontational, but constant, because now there was awareness on both sides. She knew he was watching. He knew she was aware of it, and neither of them acknowledged it, because acknowledgement would define it, and defining something limits it, so it remained unspoken, unresolved, but undeniable. The power dynamic began to shift, not in control, not in authority, but in presence. Avery was no longer just existing within his world. She was influencing how she existed within it. The difference was subtle, but critical. Before, she had been positioned. Now, she was positioning herself within the same space, within the same structure, but with awareness, with intent. And intent is where power begins. Lucien did not interfere, did not correct, did not attempt to reassert control over the shift, because he understood something important. Force, in this situation, would break the balance, and the balance was what made this interesting. His behavior remained controlled, as always, but there was something else now, something beneath the surface, a recognition, not of threat, not of danger, but of change, and change requires attention. The way he looked at her shifted, not in expression, not emotionally, but in duration, in focus, in the slight delay before his attention moved away. And that delay was enough to confirm what she already knew. He saw it, the change, the difference, the shift she had created, and he was trying to understand it. The environment around them remained the same, structured, controlled, unchanged on the surface. But beneath that surface, something had moved, something small, something invisible, but something that could not be undone, because once a dynamic shifts, it never returns to what it was. Avery felt it clearly now. The space between them was no longer defined by control alone. It was defined by awareness, by observation, by something that neither of them had fully acknowledged, but both understood. She was no longer trying to leave, and that fact alone made her more dangerous than before, because people who want to escape are predictable, but people who choose to stay are not, and unpredictability is something even control cannot fully contain. Lucien realized it, not in one moment, but in many. The way she moved, the way she observed, the way she no longer carried fear in the same way. It was gone, not completely, but enough to change how she existed in his world, enough to change how he saw her, because fear creates limitation, and without that limitation, there was something else, something far more complex, something he could not define as easily, and that was what held his attention. As the tension between them sharpened into something new, something quieter, deeper, and far more dangerous, one final realization settled into place. He realizes she's no longer afraid of him, and that changes everything. She was never meant to stay, but now he won't let her leave. By the time Lucien Cross realized Avery Quinn was no longer afraid of him, the situation had already moved beyond strategy. What began as control was becoming something else. And in a world built on precision, that kind of shift was dangerous, not because it was weak, but because it was unpredictable. The intellectual hook settled into the tension with sharp clarity. The most powerful men don't lose control easily, but when they choose not to let go, that's when control becomes obsession. That was exactly where this was heading. The pressure did not come from Avery. It came from outside, from the system, from the world Lucien had built and maintained without flaw for years. Because his world did not operate on emotion, it operated on outcome. And Avery was supposed to be an outcome, a transaction, a resolved situation. But she wasn't, and that was the problem. The deal had already been delayed once, then again, and again, each delay creating ripples through a system that was not designed for uncertainty, because uncertainty disrupts control, and Lucien's empire did not tolerate disruption. The voices around him did not question him directly. They never did. But pressure does not always need words. It exists in expectation, in structure, in the way systems begin to push back when something no longer aligns. The message was clear. She needed to be released, traded, removed from the equation, because her presence no longer made sense within the structure, and things that don't make sense become liabilities. Lucien understood that, better than anyone, because he had built the system. He had defined its rules. He had enforced its logic. And now, he was the one breaking it. That realization did not create hesitation. It created conflict, not external, not visible, but internal, because for the first time in a long time, logic and decision were not aligned. The logical choice was simple: release her, complete the deal, restore balance. That was what he should have done. That was what he always would have done. But he didn't, not because he couldn't, but because he chose not to. And that choice changed everything. Avery felt the shift before she fully understood it. Not through explanation, not through action, but through tension. The environment around her began to tighten, not physically, not restrictively, but structurally, as if something within the system was resisting the change. Because systems recognize imbalance, and she had become imbalanced. Lucien's attention toward her deepened, not just in observation, but in presence. He was no longer simply aware of her. He was focused, and focus is intention. That was new, dangerously new, because intention, when directed like this, has purpose beyond strategy. The distance between them did not disappear, but it changed, subtly, almost imperceptibly, less defined, less controlled, as if the space between them was no longer purely structural, but something else, something neither of them had named. Avery understood it slowly, piece by piece, the delays, the tension, the shift in how she was positioned within his world. It all pointed to one thing: he was choosing to keep her, not because he needed to, but because he wanted to. And that was far more dangerous than control, because control can be explained, it can be justified, it can be predicted, but want is unpredictable, and unpredictability is where systems break. The conflict between his world and his decision grew sharper, not visible to everyone, but present. The system was pushing for resolution, for closure, for logic, but Lucien was not responding to logic anymore, not entirely, and that deviation, no matter how controlled, was enough to create instability. He did not show it. Of course he didn't. His control remained intact, his decisions still precise, his authority still absolute. But beneath that surface, something had shifted, because now his decisions were not purely strategic. They were influenced, not by weakness, but by something else, something he did not define, and that made it dangerous. Avery stood within that shift, not at the center of it, but connected to it. And that connection was undeniable now. She was no longer just part of his system. She was part of his decision. And decisions, for a man like Lucien Cross, are never without consequence. The realization came to her clearly, not emotionally, not dramatically, but with precision. He was not keeping her for leverage anymore. The deal had lost its meaning, its purpose, its necessity, because if it still mattered, he would have completed it. But he hadn't, which meant one thing: she was no longer a tool, no longer transaction, no longer something to be exchanged. She was something else, something that existed outside of logic, outside of strategy, outside of the system he had built, and that made her dangerous. But it made him more dangerous too, because now he was operating outside his own rules, and men like him do not break their own rules without reason. As the tension between control and choice reached a silent but undeniable peak, one final realization settled into place. Sharp, unsettling, and impossible to ignore. He's not keeping her for leverage anymore. He's keeping her for himself. The truth didn't just explain their connection. It made it impossible to break. By the time Avery Quinn realized Lucien Cross was no longer keeping her for leverage, the situation had already crossed a line that could not be reversed. What remained was understanding. And understanding, in a world like this, is more dangerous than ignorance, because ignorance allows distance. But truth removes it completely. The intellectual hook settled into the tension between them with sharp clarity. Some truths don't just change what you know. They change what you can no longer escape. That was what this truth did. It did not arrive suddenly. It revealed itself, slowly, deliberately, as if it had always been there, waiting for the moment it could no longer be ignored. Avery had already sensed the connection, felt it in the patterns, in the names, in the fragments of a past she thought was complete. But now, the fragments aligned, and the picture became clear. Her identity was never separate from this world. It had always been part of it, not on the surface, not openly, but structurally, deeply, irreversibly. She was not just connected to the conflict surrounding Lucien's empire. She was born from it. Her past, carefully hidden, partially erased, intentionally simplified, was not what she believed it to be. It was constructed, edited, controlled, because the truth beneath it was too dangerous to remain visible. Her family had not been ordinary. They had not been distant from power. They had been part of it. A key piece in a network that once stood directly against the system Lucien now controlled. A network that had not been destroyed, but dismantled, scattered, hidden, just like her. And that realization changed everything. Lucien already knew, not every detail, not every fragment, but enough to recognize her name when it surfaced, enough to understand the implications, enough to know that her presence in his world was not coincidence, and never had been. The moment that truth fully aligned between them was not loud. It was silent, heavy, final, because now there was no illusion left, no misunderstanding, no false definition of what they were to each other. She was not just someone he had taken. She was someone connected to everything that had shaped him, everything that had built his world, everything that had defined his past. And that connection was impossible to ignore. The emotional tension reached its peak, not chaotic, not explosive, but sharp, precise, because now everything between them existed in clarity, and clarity removes protection. Betrayal existed within that truth. It had to, because she had lived her life unaware of what she truly was, because she had been brought into his world without knowing the role she played within it, because everything about her presence there had meaning beyond her understanding, and that felt like betrayal, not from him, not directly, but from the truth itself, because the truth had been hidden from her, controlled, just like everything else in this world. But alongside that betrayal was something else, something equally powerful, equally undeniable, connection, not emotional, not soft, but real, because now they were no longer separated by circumstance. They were connected by history, by structure, by something that had existed long before either of them made a choice. And that connection could not be broken. The dynamic between them shifted completely, not gradually, not subtly, but fundamentally. They were no longer captor and hostage. That definition no longer applied, because she was no longer just someone inside his world. She was part of the reason his world existed the way it did. And he was no longer just a man who controlled her situation. He was part of the past she had never been allowed to understand. That shift changed everything. The tension between them deepened, not reduced, not resolved, but intensified, because now every moment between them carried meaning. Every interaction carried weight. Every silence spoke louder than anything else. Lucien did not step away. He did not create distance, because distance now was impossible, not physically, but structurally, because removing her would not remove the connection. It would only leave it unresolved. And unresolved things do not disappear. They remain. Avery understood it too. The truth had not freed her. It had bound her, not to him, not directly, but to the reality they now shared. A reality that could not be undone, could not be ignored, could not be escaped. Because now, leaving was no longer just about distance. It was about breaking something that could not be easily broken. And that was more dangerous than staying. The intensity between them reached a point where nothing needed to be said, because everything was already understood. Fully, completely, irreversibly. They stood on opposite sides of something that connected them more than it separated them, and that contradiction was what made it impossible to walk away. As the way of the truth settled into its final form, one realization remained, sharp, unrelenting, and impossible to escape. Even knowing the truth, neither of them walks away. She was taken as a tool, but she became the one thing he couldn't lose. By the time the truth settled between them, nothing about Avery Quinn's presence in Lucien Cross's world could be defined the way it once had been. There was no clear role anymore, no simple explanation, no structure that could contain what she had become, because she was no longer a captive, and she was no longer leverage. She had become something far more dangerous, something that could not be removed without consequence. The intellectual hook settled into the final shift with quiet intensity. The most powerful transformations are not when someone gains control, but when they realize they were never meant to be controlled at all. That was who Avery had become. Not suddenly, not dramatically, but completely. Her transformation had unfolded through awareness, through truth, through the slow dismantling of everything she thought she understood about her life, her past, and her place in this world. She was no longer reacting, no longer adapting, no longer surviving. She was choosing, and that choice was what made her powerful. She moved through Lucien's world differently now, not cautiously, not fearfully, but deliberately. Every step aligned with understanding, every decision shaped by awareness. She no longer felt like something placed inside a system. She felt like something that existed within it, by choice. And that distinction changed everything. Lucien saw it. Of course he did. He had seen every shift before it fully formed. But this one was different because it was complete. There was nothing uncertain about her anymore. No hesitation, no fear to define her, no weakness to limit her. And that was something he had never expected, because when he first brought her into his world, she had been a variable. Now, she was something else entirely, a constant, something that could not be ignored, could not be dismissed, could not be removed. And that realization changed him, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could see, but internally, structurally, because control, when faced with something it cannot dominate, does not always destroy it. Sometimes it adapts to it. Lucien's control did not weaken. It evolved. His attention toward her was no longer strategic. It was focused, intentional, persistent in a way that no longer aligned with logic alone, because she was no longer part of a plan. She had become part of something else, something he had not planned, something he had not intended, something he could not undo. His obsession did not look like chaos. It did not break his world apart. It did not create visible cracks in the system he had built. Instead, it integrated itself into everything, quietly, seamlessly, becoming part of the structure itself, the way he thought, the way he decided, the way he observed. She was no longer separate from his world. She was part of how he existed within it, and that was far more dangerous than control, because control could be maintained. But attachment changes everything. The dynamic between them settled into something that could not be defined by simple terms. It was not safe. It was not balanced. It was not predictable. But it was real, more real than anything that had existed before it, because it was built on truth, on understanding, on everything they had uncovered about each other and the world they were part of. There were no illusions left, no false expectations, no misunderstandings to protect them from what this was. And that clarity made impossible to ignore. Avery no longer questioned her position. She understood it, fully, completely. She knew what Lucien was, knew what his world demanded, knew the cost of staying within it. And still, she chose to remain. Not because she had to, not because she was forced, but because leaving would not change anything. Because once you understand something this deeply, you cannot return to ignorance. And without ignorance, there is no escape. Lucien did not try to release her. Not anymore. Not even as an option. Because he understood something just as clearly as she did. Letting her go would not remove her from his world. It would only remove her from his control. And control was no longer the point. That was a final shift. The moment where everything became irreversible. because now it was no longer about power, no longer about strategy, no longer about outcome. It was about something far more dangerous, something that existed beyond all of it, something that could not be undone once it had formed. As the silence between them settled into something permanent, one final truth remained. Quiet, inevitable, and impossible to escape. He was supposed to let her go, but some things, once claimed, can never be released,